Welcome, everyone. My name is Madeline Peña, and I'm the Digital Content Manager here at the Los Angeles Public Library. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this very special program. Our City Librarian, John F. Szabo, in discussion with author Ken Bernstein about his new book, Preserving Los Angeles, How Historic Places Can Transform America's Cities. Ken Bernstein has devoted much of his career to preserving and enhancing the unique architecture and cultural heritage of America's second largest city, using historic preservation to transform communities. For Los Angeles City Planning, he directs the Office of Historic Resources and Urban Design Studio and has directed the department's citywide planning and community planning initiatives. He has led the creation of Los Angeles Comprehensive Historic Preservation Program and the completion of Survey LA, a groundbreaking citywide survey of LA's historic resources. He previously directed the preservation advocacy group of the Los Angeles Conservancy, the nation's largest membership-based local preservation organization, and lectures frequently on preservation and urban planning. John F. Szabo is the city librarian of the Los Angeles Public Library, which serves more than 4 million people, the largest and most diverse urban population of any library in the nation. He oversees the Central Library and 72 branches. In 2015, the library received the nation's highest honor for library service, the National Medal for Museum and Library Service, for its success in meeting the needs of Angelinos and providing a level of social, educational, and cultural services unmatched by any other public institution in the city. So welcome, John and Ken.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much, Madeline. And as always, thank you to all the great staff at the Los Angeles Public Library who make programs like this happen and promote them across the city and beyond. And welcome, Ken Bernstein. It is fantastic to be in conversation with you about this amazing new book. We're delighted that you're here, and welcome to everyone also and thank you for joining us. I just have to say thank you for giving us this book, this beautiful book. It really is a gift to the city of Los Angeles. It's a gift to Angelinos, and as I think we'll talk about this evening, it really is very, very relevant not only to those of us that love LA and live here, but also for people in other cities that can learn some lessons from this book. And I also just want to mention that while the book is filled with all of these incredible images from the great photographer Stephen Schaefer, images of the built environment here in LA, I was really struck by how this book was very much about people as well, and about the important lessons that can be learned from our experience with preservation here in Los Angeles. And I also really love the fact that you did not just focus on the big preservation stories, the ones that might be more familiar to people, but you lift up just dozens and dozens and dozens of neighborhoods across the city, a great focus on the incredible residential architecture here in LA. And the images in the book are not only the images of the iconic buildings that one might expect in a book about LA, but images of the real landscape and really diverse built environment in the city. So big fan of the book, love the book. Thank you so much. And just as a lead-in question, Ken, what did you want to accomplish with this book? What were your hopes for it when you began?
Well, thank you so much, John. First of all, it's such a pleasure to be with you, and your enthusiastic appreciation of the book means a great deal to me. And I think your reaction was kind of what I was hoping for with the book, very much to evoke that type of response. I had felt that there have been many books on Los Angeles architecture over the years, but in many ways, the story of historic preservation in Los Angeles, the role that it has played, the power that it has to transform communities, that story really hadn't been told in any kind of comprehensive way in book form. But even beyond that, I wanted to infuse within the book very much what you just explained. And I think it stems from my own role overseeing the historic preservation program for the second largest city in the nation, a city that is remarkably complex, fascinating, and diverse. And so often I would find myself moving around the city, working with community organizations who were trying to improve their own neighborhoods, protect the places that they care about most, and find myself thinking, wow, if only I could bring the larger public along with me and show them what I'm seeing as I move around the city, these remarkable neighborhoods, remarkable historic places. So while telling the story of the power of preservation in Los Angeles and the power that can have in other cities as well, I wanted to kind of infuse within that my own continued sense of discovery and fascination about Los Angeles, and get people to look at the city a little bit differently.
You know, it's funny you say that desire to sort of have other people see what you see in LA. And I remember thinking the same thing 8.5 years or so ago when I came to LA as city librarian, and I immediately wanted to visit all of our branch libraries, which are in all parts of the city. And I remember having the exact same kind of feeling when I went to Vermont Square or Granada Hills or Sunland Tahungas, thinking this is an amazing neighborhood, and I wish everyone could come with me and sort of see that as well. And speaking of LA and perceptions of LA, I think of LA as a place, and as I think many do, where any wild idea can take root and find an audience. It's a place that is associated with newness and reinvention and innovation, change. And also that we're a city that only looks forward and doesn't always look in the past. And frankly, I think there are many who have the perception that we're a city that doesn't value historic preservation. And yet there have been all these tremendous successes in our city. And that makes our preservation story really special. And I think also speaks to some of the lessons that can be learned and why this story and this book are relevant not only here in LA, but far beyond. So what are your thoughts, Ken, on this intersection between Los Angeles and historic preservation, and why it's particularly special and unique here?
Yeah, a lot of my motivation to write the book was around just those points, this idea, this kind of frequently expressed thought that Los Angeles is a city that doesn't care about its history, doesn't care about its historic buildings, and doesn't really do historic preservation. And I think many of us know that that's not the case. Of course, Los Angeles does have a very rich history of experimentation and innovation and architecture, openness to change. That's one of the wonderful things about it. But I think there are also a lot of misperceptions around historic preservation itself, that while we are a forward-looking city, preservation has been juxtaposed with that and being kind of pigeonholed as being backward-looking and being only about nostalgia. And, or some people really feel it's about stopping that kind of change or progress or architectural innovation. And I wanted to really show in the book how, contrary to those perceptions, both about Los Angeles and preservation itself, historic preservation really has been one of the primary engines driving positive change in the city, whether it's the revitalization of our downtown, creating more of a 24-hour downtown through adaptive reuse, converting buildings to new uses, the revitalization of many of our neighborhoods, even creating new housing or new affordable housing in the city. And so I wanted to provide some compelling examples of how preservation really has been a forward-looking engine of change and can't just be pigeonholed as being about kind of wallowing in nostalgia.
Sure. Well, one of those areas of success that I think people point to is adaptive reuse, that converting historic buildings to new uses. What's the reason for this success, and what's the ultimate value of its impact on LA?
Yeah, well, one of the key reasons for the success in Los Angeles was actually a planning and zoning ordinance. To get wonky about it, we in the city of Los Angeles about 20 years ago passed something called the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance that actually cleared away many of what had been zoning land use impediments to converting older and historic commercial buildings to housing. So no longer did you have to provide the code level parking of a new building and so on. And that just kind of opened the floodgates to conversion of buildings that had been largely vacant above the ground floor. And we saw the production of more than 9,000 new units of housing in downtown alone in the first decade or so of the adaptive reuse ordinance. And I have brought along, since this is meant to be, it's a visually striking book, I hope, as you've said. I have brought along some images tonight to show some case studies. If we can go to the first one, thank you, which is of the subway terminal building downtown. This is at 4th and Hill, and that was converted under the adaptive reuse ordinance to 277 new units of housing. And it's a notable building. Actually, many people don't know that we had a subway in Los Angeles before the Red Line in the 1990s. We had a 1-mile subway from this building at 4th and Hill, a mile west to the intersection of Glendale and Beverly. But the train stopped running in the 1950s, and this building was largely vacant by the 90s. So the adaptive reuse ordinance allowed its regeneration into loft-style apartments. And you can see the beauty and the authenticity of the commercial building's lobby that's now a residential entrance, and the type of ambiance and character that historic rehabilitation can bring. But I also, in the book, wanted to underscore that creative reuse like this hasn't been limited just to downtown or projects under the adaptive reuse ordinance. If we could go to the next slide, it's also really helping to benefit commercial enterprises and businesses. And this is in the Playa Vista community near the coast, the old Howard Hughes spruce goose hangar that had been vacant for decades. And when Google came looking in Los Angeles for a new kind of flagship building, a site as part of LA's Silicon Beach, it wasn't looking at kind of traditional commercial office building, but at a historic hangar where Howard Hughes constructed the spruce goose. It only flew once, of course. And a beautiful adaptive reuse with CGF architects and Google collaborating to make this creative office space. And again, there's kind of this synergy between Howard Hughes and his creativity and the iconoclastic nature that he brought to this site, and all of the tech companies that are now within both not only the Spruce Goose building, but what's called the Hercules campus as part of Silicon Beach. So again, that economic power of adaptive reuse.
Yeah, that's really incredible, that hangar and the way they really incorporated sort of exterior architectural elements within an interior space, probably for practical reasons, but also aesthetic as well. It's an incredible space, an enormous space for sure. When I think of preservation in LA, I of course think of LA Conservancy and the founding of the Conservancy, and all of us at the LA Public Library are particularly proud of our early connection with the LA Conservancy when it was founded in 1978. And there was a group of people that were seeking to keep the Central Library, the amazing Central Library that I'm actually in right now, from being demolished. And this is, of course, several years prior to the horrible fire that happened in the building in 1986. And there was that sort of preservation movement here in LA. Can you talk about that sort of history of historic preservation and advocacy and what it's meant for LA?
Yeah, I think you're right, John, that the preservation story certainly is very tied into the preservation fight around the Central Library. And that was the catalyst in many ways for the formation of the LA Conservancy, which has since then grown into the largest local historic preservation organization in terms of membership in the US. So again, kind of exploding that myth that Angelenos don't care about historic preservation. But that was in the 1970s, and it came on the heels of a lot of unfortunate losses. The demolition of the Atlantic Richfield building, replaced by the Arco Towers, one of the great Art Deco buildings of the city, the Irving Gill Dodge House, the clearance of Bunker Hill and its Victorian-era architecture in the 1960s. So preservation activism had been sort of brewing, and the concern about the preservation of the built environment had been brewing, but it was the Central Library that was the catalyst for a lot of that activity. And then the Wiltern Theater became threatened around the same time, another great Art Deco building, and Wayne Ratkovich, preservation-minded developer, with architect Brenda Levin on one of her first preservation projects collaborated in its rehabilitation. But the Central Library, I think, to me, speaks to, again, many of the themes of the book as well, which are the power of preservation, the ability to combine rehabilitation with compatible new additions to really reimagine our historic spaces. And that was done so beautifully in the 1990s. The Central Library, I'm very excited to hear that the library is reopening next Monday. It is one of those, my favorite places in the city. One of those places, when I get asked, where do I take out of towners who want to see the real Los Angeles and historic spaces, Central Library is always one of the stops. So I'm really pleased that it will be reopening. But again, it speaks to the ability of Los Angeles to continue to evolve and adapt its historic places for the needs of contemporary communities.
Sure. And these fights sometimes can also be great ways to a catalyst for bringing people together. There can also be certainly battles over historic preservation, obviously, but in that instance, it really very much brought the city together. And then the city came together again when it was time to restore the building after the fire and expand it. And it's lovely to lead an institution where people have such a universal fondness and a love for the building, and to think that it's a great example of Los Angeles really stepping forward and saying it's important that we preserve this incredible piece of our history. Speaking of sort of capturing and inventorying that history, there has been this unbelievable, and you've been at the lead on this, and it's hard to even fathom, but it has been an amazing, ambitious project called Survey LA. And I don't know if it's correct to say that it's sort of crowdsourcing really important information about historic places, but that was my take from it when I was reading about it in the book. Can you talk about Survey LA? And I mean, you're its ambassador and champion, and there's a great deal of it in the books. Please tell us about it.
Sure. Well, Survey LA was our first ever attempt to comprehensively take stock of our historic places in Los Angeles. And it was a multi-year, almost a decade-long effort, a partnership between the city of Los Angeles and the Getty Foundation and the Getty Conservation Institute that provided support for the project. And it has culminated in the creation of a comprehensive inventory of all of our historic places in Los Angeles that's available online at historicplacesla.org. And it was a daunting task when we set out to do this, because we're a huge city. We have 470 square miles or so, 880,000 separate parcels across Los Angeles to consider. And survey teams, which were professional historic preservation consultants, actually went out and down every street in Los Angeles to identify historic places. But it was, as you said, guided by a kind of a crowdsourcing approach, a very robust community engagement process, where months before we were out in any community, we would, with the survey teams, we would be working closely with community organizations to tap into that collective knowledge about what are the places that mattered to local community members, and trying to get beyond just the obvious architectural gems of any community, which would be apparent to qualified architectural historians who do the survey, but tap into those places that have deeper kind of social and cultural meaning in a community, the community hangouts, the longtime kind of legacy businesses of a community, the places that really shaped the growth and development and evolution and identity of these places across the city. And that was a really key, instrumental part of the process. But my mantra on the survey all along was that this was about really guiding good planning in the city. That's why we did it. Not just to have the information, which is valuable in itself, but to use that information to plan a better city, to help guide our long-range plans, to know what areas we want to protect because they are rich with historic places, rich with historic neighborhoods, versus areas we might be able to allow for more intense new development, and to also flag that information for developers or property owners before they buy a property or propose a project that they know what they're getting into if a site does have historic value, so we can avoid some of those 11th hour preservation battles that arise. So I wanted the book, because this has been such an important effort to the city and really the kind of basis for our entire historic preservation program. I wanted the book to reflect the work that had been done. And it takes a village to do the survey. And thank you for crediting me as the head of the office, but there were more than 200 professionals and volunteers. My deputy manager of our office, Janet Hansen, spearheading this over more than a decade. But we wanted to kind of showcase this work and to really also indicate that Survey LA shows how every community of Los Angeles has tremendous architectural heritage and places of social and cultural significance, often these kind of hidden gems, hidden in plain sight in many ways across the city. And so we really made a point of, in the book, showcasing every community. Again, I've brought some images if now's a good time.
Absolutely. Let's look at them.
Okay. Well, great. This is actually the spread that kicks off the section we call Survey LA Discoveries. Again, some of the most interesting finds. This is a discovery in itself. And Steven Schaefer, our photographer, captured the interior of this Northridge Congregational Church designed by A. Quincy Jones just so beautifully as the opener to that section. But I wanted in this section to not have this be sort of the architectural greatest hits of Los Angeles. That's not what Survey LA was about, but to kind of capture places that would evoke, even for lifelong Angelenos, that, wow, I never knew that was there. And I'm still discovering, even though I've lived here all my life. So if we go to the next slide. Great. So some examples of that. This is a house in the Boyle Heights community called the Q Sing Chan residence from 1898. So it's a Queen Anne design, kind of Victorian era home of the late 19th century, which is notable in itself, but more so for its social history. It was the home of one of the few Chinese Americans to be able to own property in Boyle Heights during a period where there was tremendous anti-immigration sentiment and out-and-out discrimination. And Chan had been a court interpreter in China who moved to Boyle Heights, Los Angeles, and became the first Methodist minister of Chinese descent in the US. If we can go to the next photo. And not too far away in Boyle Heights, we highlighted the Mexican Mission Church. And many of you may know Amy Semple McPherson and her story, creation of the Foursquare Gospel Church and Angelus Temple in Echo Park. But she also created a network of smaller churches around the city that were meant to do early outreach to the growing Mexican-American community of Los Angeles. And this is one of those examples from 1930. And this has functioned as a church for a Spanish-speaking population for over 8 decades in Boyle Heights. Next slide. So sometimes we just wanted to show, some places that were fun and interesting. And I think this is one of those, a little taste of Europe in the Hollywood Hills, a Campanile that is in the Alta Loma community in the Hollywood Hills. And this is actually a freestanding elevator tower that is meant to provide access to some of the hillside homes from garages below. And it's linked to a network of concrete staircases and walkways in the hills above Hollywood.
That's a mighty important elevator to those folks.
It sure is, the high tower from 1923. And then heading to the West San Fernando Valley, again, this is truly one of those architectural showstoppers, beautifully photographed for the book, the Epiphany Lutheran Church in Canoga Park, designed by an architect I had not been aware of before the survey, Edward Davies, as this soaring A-frame chapel with kind of mid-century modernism, what's often called Googie style influences, kind of just creates that optimism of the mid-century period in a religious structure. And then to head to South LA for some examples, this is the Vermont Knolls neighborhood, one of those just beautifully intact residential neighborhoods kind of off the beaten track in Los Angeles. This dates from 1928 to 1939. And this is just adjacent to what was the original Pepperdine University campus before Pepperdine moved to Malibu in the early 1970s. And Vermont Knolls, you can see, has this just striking consistency of massing, even though there's a very interesting variation of designs and forms along with that. But just a beautiful neighborhood that's trying right now to achieve local historic district, historic preservation overlay zone status. And a few miles east of that is a neighborhood called Goodyear Gardens, which also, again, I had not been aware of at all prior to Survey LA. It was developed around 1920, and it's about 49 residences that were constructed by the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company that was nearby on Central Avenue in South LA as an industrial hub of the community. And one of the few examples of this kind of worker housing developed by a major corporation kind of speaks to the history of LA as an industrial center and the link between our industrial manufacturing and a residential community. And then just the last example I'll show of some of these Survey LA discoveries. And again, this is just a sampling of more than 300 that are in the book. This is one that speaks to what I like to call layers of history in Los Angeles. It's called the Crenshaw-Sanon district, and it's just off Crenshaw Boulevard near Leimert Park, about 71 homes. And just visually, this speaks to the evolution of Los Angeles neighborhoods, that this neighborhood had a large Japanese American population, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, after the Japanese American internment, and when that community returned to Los Angeles and in many cases was able to buy single family homes for the first time. And what you can see is that although there's been tremendous demographic change in the neighborhood since then, the African American community, continued diverse communities moving into the neighborhood, you can see the bonsai, other Japanese American landscaping and Japanese design features. It kind of makes the layers of demographic change in Los Angeles, the layers of history in LA visible. And that's a lot of what I wanted to showcase in the book, in every community, is sites like this that really speak to some of these larger themes and larger truths about Los Angeles and our communities and their identity.
You mentioned 300 images from Survey LA, and those projects that are in the book.
Yeah, I think we have over 300 photos that Stephen Schaefer took, and that's called. I will tell you, Schaefer, our photographer, did a remarkable job, and he will tell everyone who listens that I gave him a 65-page shot list to start from, to guide him, and with instructions as to what we wanted to show. But he's a preservationist himself, which really makes a difference. He is active in his community in Ventura and historic preservation. He's on the board of the California Preservation Foundation. So he just has an intuitive sense of how to capture some of these places. And his 65-page shot list became 19,000 raw photos that he took that got distilled down. He says that ended up as 1 in 65 that made the final cut of the book.
Wow. Seems like the perfect partner for this.
Absolutely.
For sure. One of the things, you were talking about Survey LA and sort of setting the stage for the sheer scope of it. One of the things I loved in the book was there's a map that really helps folks to understand the expanse of the city of Los Angeles, and it includes the maps from and the geographies from I think 6 other U.S. cities, plus the island of Manhattan.
Exactly, it's 8 of the largest cities actually. It's St. Louis, Boston, Philadelphia. It's several others.
Minneapolis and Cleveland were in there.
Exactly, the island of Manhattan. I'm sorry I didn't bring that image. The island of Manhattan is that little harbor gateway connective tissue down to our harbor district. So,
yeah, many of my family are from Cleveland, and Cleveland just fit beautifully there along the coast. But anyway, for folks at home, be sure to get the book and check out that map. It really gives you a sense of LA's expansive geography. I want to shift to talking a little bit about affordable housing, which factors into these conversations about historic preservation. And when we have in the city big conversations about affordable housing, the increased need for density, the high cost of housing, of course, historic preservation efforts can sometimes be criticized for hindering what is seemingly a very reasonable and necessary goal. Can you talk a little bit about that juxtaposition and how you see it?
Yeah, certainly. This is a huge issue today. And obviously, we have a very significant housing crisis, housing affordability, a homelessness crisis. We're seeing state legislation, both some that's been adopted and some that's still proposed and pending this year, that are speaking to many of those issues. But the book isn't taking a position on any of that, but is kind of speaking to how historic preservation and housing and density and change are not mutually exclusive, and how they really can be compatible, and how preservation can be part of the housing solution. And just as an example of that, it's important to point out that LA's historic districts, while I think many people have in their minds that they are single family neighborhoods with large lawns and very low density, that's actually not the reality overall of our historic preservation overlay zones or historic districts. There was a study last year called Preservation Positive, commissioned by the LA Conservancy for Place Economics was the firm that looked at all this data. And they found that the residential density in our historic districts is actually 50% higher than the density of the rest of the residential communities citywide. And the density in our historic districts is higher than the average density in Boston, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. That said, I mean, we do need to make sure that we are balanced and not having preservation impede sensible new opportunities to infill with housing. I do have a couple of just images I wanted to show on this theme. If we could bring it, there's a photo of the three. Here it is. So this is actually just an example of one of our historic districts. This is the Lincoln Heights Historic Preservation Overlay Zone, and showing kind of some of the eclectic housing options that are in some of our historic districts. So on the left, you have a hipped roof cottage that may still be a single family home, could be a duplex. Next to that, a triplex that's a Spanish colonial revival design, and then an apartment building next to it in a prairie craftsman style. And so you have this sort of more natural, walkable, and vibrant density in many of our historic districts that still all kind of hang together. And we're also finding that it's possible to adapt many of our historic buildings and add on to them in a sensible way for new housing, new affordable housing. We have an example. If we go to the next slide, and this is the, if we can go to full screen on this for a second, I just want to point out the slide on the picture on the left. It's a little hard to see. The 28th Street YMCA in South LA was designed by Paul Revere Williams, again, one of the iconic architects of Los Angeles. And in the photo on the left in front of the entrance, he is the fifth from the left in the front row when he was very young in the 1920s. And this building had been a community center for the African-American community in South LA for decades. If we can go to the next slide. And then two nonprofits have collaborated now to convert it to 24 units of housing for low-income residents in the historic building. And on the right, you can see the community center, the kitchen of the historic YMCA. And again, it's a little small. You might be able to see there's a little red tile portion on the right of that photo. That's the outline of where there had been a historic swimming pool in that space. And again, this went through Historic Preservation Review. Our Office of Historic Resources, our Cultural Heritage Commission, allowed this to be adapted and evolve into a community center for affordable housing, but with also a very contemporary new design behind the YMCA, designed by Koenig Eisenberg architects, providing 25 new units of affordable housing. We have a number of other examples in the book, the Boyle Hotel in Boyle Heights, other examples where new housing has been provided, even in high-rise form, such as CBS Columbia Square in Hollywood, that has both housing and a new commercial office building with a preserved historic structure. So preservation doesn't need to be standing in the way of housing opportunity.
Sure. And the red that we see there on the right, you mentioned, is a intentional marker so that there's a reference to that.
A reference to the outline of where the tile of the pool, of the edge of the pool had been in this space. So kind of keeping that history legible even within a very converted interior space.
That's great. It reminds me of a conversion of part of Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto, which is a iconic hockey arena for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And they did a conversion. It's a grocery store in part of that building, and they have marked on the floor of the grocery store where center ice was and the goals were, and it's just sort of a reference to help people.
Well, that's great. I hadn't seen that.
Yeah. So, talking about LA, we regularly and proudly describe ourselves as one of the most diverse cities in the nation and indeed the world. And how does the city make certain that our preservation work embraces this diversity, that we use the stories and histories, and you just were mentioning some of them, of our diverse communities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is something that was very important to us in pursuing Survey LA and much of our work over the last decade or more. And through Survey LA, Office of Historic Resources helped create a series of preservation frameworks that reflect many of our diverse communities of the city. These are documents that are called historic context statements that are really meant to guide the future identification and designation of historic resources, tying those to the themes that really shaped the evolution or identities of many communities. So creating that kind of framework for understanding what's important, and then allowing the identification of individual places to really build from that work. And we are proud that we were able to create these types of contexts, these frameworks, in partnership with many of our communities of Los Angeles, including an African-American context, Latino Los Angeles context, 5 Asian American contexts, the first LGBT context of any major city in the country, and a women's rights context as well, really looking at the history of women's rights in Los Angeles from the early suffrage movement in the late 19th, early 20th century through feminism and the places that were associated with that. So trying to do what we can to really lift up those histories, lift up those stories, and use that as a basis for future designation. But there's a lot more to be done. I think we recognize that we've fallen short in many ways as well.
Sure. One of the things that also struck me about the book was that you specifically reference, and actually I think there's a section in the book that speaks to preservation and systemic racism, which is incredibly timely, should be always. And in that section, you specifically call out the names George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and reference this conversation that has come out of a national focus on racial justice, and how historic preservation has in some cases played a role in reinforcing racist practices and outcomes, and of course redlining, and there are all sorts of examples. But can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I think obviously there's been a national conversation, as you've referenced, in many ways around these issues of systemic racism, implicit bias, all of these topics. And I think the preservation community, there's been a real grappling with these issues, particularly heightened over the last year or so. I think it's important to note that we have to kind of call out some of the ways that we've fallen short as a historic preservation community. And today, only about 6% of our designated landmarks, our historic cultural monuments in the city, are associated with persons of color, about 3% for the African American community specifically. And I think we're really taking a close look at preservation practices and processes to see, why, we get a better understanding of why that's the case. And I think, just as an example, as to one reason why there may be such a disparity, we have a very open and democratic process for submitting landmark historic cultural monument nominations in the city. Anyone can submit a nomination to our office and the Cultural Heritage Commission, but that does tend to privilege those who have the time and resources to participate in city processes. And it also privileges those sites that may have been well documented through past scholarship and research versus those places that, again, may be well known in their own communities, but haven't been the subject of attention and research in the same way. And so, I think we need to take a look at all of those practices. And in that vein, I think it's important to note our Office of Historic Resources and the Getty, through the Getty Conservation Institute, just earlier this month announced a new extension of our Survey LA partnership to create a program called Los Angeles African American Historic Places, which is an effort to rectify many of these disparities and really look at all of our historic preservation processes and practices through an anti-racist lens. And we're gearing up for we've announced that, but gearing up for the full-fledged launch of that, we hope later this summer, to tackle this work over the next 2 to 3 years.
And you and I were involved in the Civic Memory Working Group, an effort here in the city to look at memory and how the city memorializes events and all. And I think one of the lessons out of that is just a relentless and very intentional effort to make certain that all voices are at the table and involved in the process, and that good things come when that's the case. And when you look at where there have been missteps and problems and errors in the past, it's usually a case of the voice not being at the table. And that's great to hear about that particular project, and ensuring that that historic sites and cultural monuments can make certain that they're included and part of it. So one of my favorite parts of the book, and in the introduction I referenced how the book was certainly about the built environment with all of these incredible images, but that it also was very much a book about people. And you have several individuals that are highlighted throughout the book, and their preservationist profiles. Gail Canard was one of them that I particularly was drawn to, because she was part of our working group and someone I know. But that was really a lovely element of the book, and a reminder that it is that this work very much is about the people engaged in it, who care about it and who bring expertise and advocacy.
Well, that's exactly what I want to do. I think we have an image of Gail's profile. Might bring that one up. It's a little bit small, but you can see her there. Gail's the vice president of our Cultural Heritage Commission, and also happens to be head of KDG Design, which is the oldest Black-owned and operated architectural firm in Los Angeles. She's carrying on, as she talks about in her profile, the architectural legacy of her father, Robert Canard. But John, I think you said it exactly right. I mean, it's a book, obviously, that's visually rich in terms of showing a lot of beautiful buildings and places. And I thought it would be unfortunate if people got so caught up in the, just admiring the beauty of Los Angeles and some of the places we're showing, and neglecting the fact that preservation ultimately is about people, that it's people who give life and meaning to the places that we're featuring, who've shaped them over the years, and people whose commitment and ongoing passion really makes preservation possible in the first place. And I wanted to highlight not only the traditional preservation leaders, so Linda Dishman, the CEO of the LA Conservancy, is highlighted, but also many non-traditional preservationists. One of those, for example, is Bobby Green, who is a bar owner. He heads the 1933 group, but he's made it his practice to help transform great historic spaces into successful bars and nightclubs, like the Highland Park Bowl or the Idle Hour in North Hollywood, where he transformed an old whiskey barrel, an example of programmatic architecture, into a revitalized nightclub. It's been a rough year for Bobby and his businesses, unfortunately, but we're hopeful that many of those places will again be as successful as they were before the pandemic.
Yeah, it's an amazing bowling alley transformed in Highland Park there. I will say there are two things I love about the Gail Canard photo. Gail, who's absolutely fabulous and wonderful, but the building behind her, just
Central Library.
The library. So yeah. I'm a little biased, but just wanted to call that out. I loved where the photograph there was taken.
And all of our preservation profile subjects chose the locations of their photos. So Gail made a point of choosing that as one of her favorite locations in Los Angeles.
That's great to hear. Well, I'll have to thank her next time I see her. Ken, what are some future challenges affecting preservation here in the city? We've talked about some of them, but what lies ahead there?
Yeah, I grapple with that in the book a bit as well. And again, as I said, one of the things that excites me about historic preservation is it's not just looking about the past. We need to be forward-looking and engaged with preservation, be engaged with the challenges of the future. One of those, and it may not be obvious to many, the link, but is really the climate challenge, climate change, and our climate challenge locally and globally. And I think there's a growing movement that calls itself climate heritage, really the intersection of climate action and cultural heritage, looking at how historic preservation community can be front and center in the climate action movement. And we know that the greenest building is the building that's already built, that it can take decades for even the greenest new building to make up for the carbon impacts of demolition and replacement. So we know that that historic preservation is good for kind of mitigating climate impacts. We need to make our existing historic buildings more energy efficient as well. But also we need to take stock of which of our cultural treasures, what of our cultural heritage is most at risk from the changing climate. And it's been said, if the bulldozer was the historic preservation threat of the 20th century, climate may be a growing threat in the 21st century. We've seen wildfires consume many of our beloved historic places, and rising sea levels in our coastal communities, such as Venice, are going to present a significant threat to our intact cultural heritage in these communities. And we need to be at the table in addressing that. And then we've talked about some of the racial justice challenges and equity issues that are front and center. But I kind of close the book with what I call a call for what I term people-centered preservation. It gets back to what we talked about with the profiles. And again, looking at historic preservation, not only as bricks and mortar, but about how we evolve some of our tools or come up with new historic preservation tools to protect and interpret and give meaning to the people who inhabit some of those places, cultural traditions and practices associated with some of those places. And that may go beyond historic designation and what we've done in the past to look at ways that we protect and support legacy businesses that define our community, or think about interpretive programs and making more legible some of the history in our community that reflects all of the voices and all of the traditions in our community. So that's what I hope is part of the future of preservation, that more people-centered approach.
One other question I wanted to ask, and then we have some questions I know from the audience. I want to give them the opportunity to ask them. But we've been in this pandemic for over a year. How has the pandemic affected your understanding, your perceptions, your views of either or both LA and historic preservation, that arena?
Yeah, it's a great question. I had to grapple with that. I wrote most of the first draft of the book just prior to the pandemic. And then the book got delayed a little bit. Shafe, our photographer, couldn't get into all of the featured sites on the schedule we hoped to. So it got set back a few months. So I had some time to think about that question and whether I wanted to revisit any of the book. And I ended up adding a very short kind of Los Angeles after COVID afterward that touches on some of those issues. And I was concerned that the kind of vibrant historic preservation activity I was describing in the book and the way it was giving that type of vitality to communities, that might not be the Los Angeles we come back to. And I think that's still, the jury's still out on some of that to some degree. But, we're at this moment, we're all starting to reemerge from social distancing and re-engage with the city in a way that has felt distant itself over the last year. And I think, to me, it really speaks to the power of some of the themes that are discussed in the book, that as we re-engage with the city, it's our historic places that uniquely provide us that sense of connection and community that's been missing over the last year. And, we're in an increasingly fragmented world, and we want to reconnect to those places. I think it's been interesting to me, the discussion about the Cinerama Dome in the last week or two, as Pacific Theaters announced that they would not be reopening the ArcLight cinemas. Mm-hmm. And, just the reaction that evoked from so many members of the public The architecture is fantastic, of course. It's the only all-concrete geodesic dome in the world, but the connection that people feel to these historic places and what that meant for cinema in Los Angeles. I'm a baseball fan. The way people connect to Dodger Stadium, as now the third oldest ballpark in the major leagues, and just the relief people felt going back to the stadium. So the historic places have that power, and I think our historic preservation programs and the tools that we have to offer are going to be even more in demand coming out of this period.
And when those buildings get threatened, or there's conversation about their future, all sorts of creative ideas come forward about adaptive reuse and all. Well. So right now, I'd like to ask the wonderful Madeline Pena to join us again and help facilitate some of the questions that have come in from our audience.
Yes, so if you have questions, please write them in the comments for our audience on Facebook and YouTube. And we have a question from Rosalba. I'm going to bring it up on the screen. And Rosalba asks, would you talk about how people of color are impacted by historic preservation? I feel as if it would push low-income and folks out of communities through gentrification. I know you talk a little bit about it, but I know Rosalba had this question early on. Thank you, Rosalba.
No, it's a great question. I did touch on it a bit, but obviously it's a very complex set of questions, and it's hard to generalize in terms of the answer. But again, I think getting back to some of the research that's been done on this and just my experience in Los Angeles, we have 35 local historic districts, historic preservation overlay zones in Los Angeles now. Many of those have been adopted for 2 or 3 decades. I spoke earlier about Lincoln Heights as an example. We have Pico Union as one of our historic preservation overlay zones. They've been HPOZs for about 20 years each. And we've not really seen dramatic demographic changes in some of these communities. In fact, in terms of incomes, both of those still have a median income that's less than about half of the citywide median. And that is actually true in the majority of our designated historic preservation overlay zones in the city. 20 of the 35 still have a median income that's lower than the citywide median, and 21 of the 35 have a percentage of persons of color that is higher than that average of the citywide population overall. So I think there's been some change in some of those communities, but we haven't seen, by and large, kind of wholesale gentrification or displacement. And I think it speaks to the fact that many of our historic neighborhoods are continuing to attract just a vibrant mix of residents from all backgrounds. And we have to continue to watch that, though, and obviously continue to provide affordable housing opportunities in those neighborhoods, be open to housing strategies such as accessory dwelling units, ways of inserting new housing in a way that isn't incompatible, to allow those communities to continue to change and evolve. But it's a great question and something that we'll continue to grapple with.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Rosalba. We have another question from Rosalba, and here it is. What does historic preservation mean to those who live in areas that you look to preserve?
Another great question, and I think it means, of course, different things to different communities. I think, speaking about some of the neighborhoods I just mentioned, such as Lincoln Heights, I think that's a great example of all these historic preservation overlay zones are really grassroots, bottom-up efforts that really come from the community itself, where the city is assisting in those efforts, but not imposing this from the top down. And one of the preservation profiles that John mentioned was Michael Diaz, a community member in Lincoln Heights, who spoke about the effort to really kind of see historic preservation as a community revitalization tool and a community building tool to bring people together, to attract residents who had a common commitment to their own neighborhood. Often the historic designation also spills over to assist communities to work together, to confront a whole set of other community challenges. And the Lincoln Heights community is also a great example. You have in that neighborhood the Church of the Epiphany that was significant not only architecturally, but was a focal point of the Chicano rights movement of the 1960s, early 1970s. Cesar Chavez spoke and did organizing there. La Raza newspaper was headquartered at Church of the Epiphany. Number of other locations that speak to that kind of community memory and history, and kind of the social history of the neighborhood that goes beyond the physical and architectural preservation. So I think there's great meaning to that in many of our neighborhoods.
We have 3 more questions. We have from Susan. Is there a website where you could see the historical preservation overlays?
Yes. Actually, we have on our planning department website, each of our historic preservation overlay zones has a dedicated page and a map. That is at planning.lacity.org. And then click on historic preservation, and the section on historic districts has a dedicated page. It has the historic preservation plans for each of those 35 historic overlays, and a little profile and some photos of each of them. So that's the best place to see all of our historic districts in the city. If you want to go tour them yourself, there's a map and guidance on each of those.
From Brenda, what area of building would you like to see preserved that it is under threat?
That is a tough one. In terms of what's under threat currently, I think I mentioned earlier the Cinerama Dome. I don't know that is truly threatened. It actually has historic designation as a city historic cultural monument, but certainly remain hopeful that will be adaptively reused in the future. I think a number of our historic theaters also come to mind that may or may not be truly under threat. We've done a great job in Los Angeles beginning to reinvest in some of our Broadway historic theater district, with the Orpheum Theater becoming a revitalized venue. Apple has now taken the Tower Theater, a block from the Orpheum, as an Apple store. But we do have many of our historic theaters that are perhaps in a more precarious state. There's the old Warner Pacific. The Pacific Theaters is actually owned on Hollywood. It's one of our Hollywood Boulevard theaters. And it's the last of the Hollywood theaters really to have its future more secured. We have Disney that reinvested in the El Capitan. The Egyptian Theater is now in the hands of Netflix with American Cinematheque. We've talked about the Cinerama Dome, but that Warner Pacific was one of our great historic theaters of Hollywood, and it's still in a very precarious state. And so we hope to see a positive solution for that and other historic theaters.
And also there's an important role, and not that these are under threat, but an important role for local government as well to play in terms of preservation of buildings. You mentioned Lincoln Heights. I think of our 3 surviving Carnegie libraries, Lincoln being one of them, Vermont Square, the Jewel Box that's there also, and then Cahuenga on Santa Monica Boulevard. And what it says to a community and what it does for a community and its health and revitalization and the residential community there when local government preserves buildings like that are important.
Exactly. I mean, the city needs to also be a good steward of its historic resources, and at times we've done a good job of that collectively as a city family. At times, maybe less so. But fortunately, we also have a great partner. Project Restore is a nonprofit that does excellent work, help preserve and restore LA City Hall, Van Nuys City Hall, as well as Hollyhock House in Barnstall Park, which is now a World Heritage, our first Los Angeles UNESCO World Heritage site. So we're very proud of that and the role that Project Restore has played in the city.
We have 2 more questions. This question comes from Ben Chavez. What is or are the reasons Los Angeles continues to be perceived as an architectural wasteland?
I hope that this book puts that to rest once and for all. I don't know that I can speak to why there's that misperception. I think it's those who really haven't taken the time to see and get to know Los Angeles. And obviously, we have our schlocky mini malls as well. Although I have a great photo of a mini mall in the book in the form of a 1970s Fleetwood Cadillac. So we even have some noteworthy mini malls. So yes, we have some architecture that we are not proud of in the city. But I hope that this book puts that to rest once and for all. We have a great architectural tradition, tradition of innovation going back to the last century, certainly. We were on the cutting edge of many architectural styles, whether it was the arts and crafts, craftsman movement, Art Deco, mid-century modernism, and others, and continue to produce innovative architecture. So, I hope that anyone who gets this book spends some time with it and then uses that as a springboard for their own exploration and discovery of LA, its architecture, and its communities won't endure with that misperception.
We have time for one more question. It comes from Maria Novoa. How is it decided if and when a historic building needs restoration, especially if it may affect the original detail and architecture?
Yeah, great question. In city government, we are really, in many ways, we're kind of partners with property owners. Unless it's a city-owned property itself, the vast majority of our city landmarks and the properties that are in our historic preservation overlay zones are privately owned. So it's really up to the individual property owner themselves to determine, are they willing and able to invest in those buildings, restore them, rehabilitate them. And we're there as a partner to help review that, ensure that it meets appropriate historic preservation standards, provide technical assistance or information or resources. There are also historic preservation incentives that come into play. There's a federal rehabilitation tax credit program. Our office offers a property tax incentive program called the Mills Act that helps provide some resources for property owners who make that longer term commitment to substantially rehabilitate their property. So we're there really as a partner, but again, that's why, preservation is about people. It takes that commitment by individual property owners as stewards of their property to make that happen in partnership with the city.
Thank you. So the book is available from our library catalog. We've shared the link through the stream, so you can check out the book, place a hold, and if you like to purchase your own copy, it is also available from the library store. So thank you so much, Ken, for joining us today, and John, our fabulous city librarian, for the lively and wonderful conversation. I was enjoying the program, and I learned so much, so thank you. What a wonderful book. Any last words?
Yes, I just want to say thank you, Ken, and I don't know whether it was the book. I believe it was an article about the book recently where it mentioned your father driving you around the San Fernando Valley where you grew up, and you used a Thomas guide to determine where to go, and you learned about neighborhoods. And having read this wonderful book, Preserving Los Angeles, I am so glad that he took you around that car and that was your initial inspiration. Thank you so much for this gift to Los Angeles, this incredible book, for your passion around preserving Los Angeles, historic preservation, and helping to celebrate the City of Angels. We appreciate it. And thanks so much for being here this evening. And thanks to our audience as well.
Well, thank you, John. It's been a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. And thanks, Madeline, as well, and all the great staff at the LA Public Library. Thanks, everyone.